here's what it is. Geodesy, determination of size and shape of the Earth and its gravity field. Now, if that does not roll off your tongue, just on your way home, stop at a tattoo shop and get that just tattooed on your arm, because it's really important. Virtually nothing works without geodesy. Everything happens in a place, and it's important that we know where place is. Chris was talking about the astronomic coordinates and the importance of those astronomic coordinates. We rely on those coordinates in our daily lives. Everybody today has GPS. If you got one of these, and probably 75% of the people on the planet have one of these, you have access to the global positioning system. Most people never even think about where they are. But today, you punch in a place, it takes you right there. It's the geodetic astronomy that got us there. And it's the geodesy, the science of geodesy, that is the foundation that holds GPS together as a system. Talking about the astronomy part of it, it's important to understand the geodesy that it supports. So we all know conceptually what the Earth looks like. And most of us learn our coordinates, latitude and longitude, probably in about the 6th grade. Teacher comes in, has a globe, teaches you what latitude and longitude is, and you write it down. And on Friday, you have a test, and you write it down, and you get it right, you get the gold star on your forehead. And you take that piece of information, you put it in the back of your brain, and you never have to use it again. You never had to use it. The overwhelming majority of people have never had to use it because you had no capability for personal positioning. So you didn't really have to use it. You kind of know what it is, sort of vaguely. But the reality is, what we learned in school really is not the case. The Earth is a very complex body, as we all know. The Earth, now this is an exaggeration, don't you?
Really?
But it's kind of, yeah, really, you think? This is actually a description of, in its own way, based on space-based measurements of the gravity field, of looking at the bumpiness of the Earth's gravity field if we allowed the planet, if we could allow the planet to stop rotating, and we were able to allow the oceans to just fall into place and simmer down for just a few seconds. It would be this bumpy surface. Because the underlying structure of mass differs from place to place. So therefore gravity changes from place to place. And that's a really important function in precise positioning. And the science of geodesy is one that tries to describe that. If we look at it, the collection of measurements and coordinates and heights are commonly referred to as a datum. And a datum is just some collection of measurements that describe how we are going to define coordinates or heights. So coordinates is kind of an easy one to think of. We all are aware of Greenwich as the 0 meridian. How many people have been to Greenwich? A bunch of you all stood there on the line, you get the picture taken. It's not there. It's not there. The line is about 100 meters out to the east. Maybe I'll come back to that. But that's a known quantity. So we feel comfortable with those kinds of concepts. Heights. I could say, oh, I want to reference all the heights in this room to the top of this table. Well, I would just create a datum. Commonly in heights, we think of, quote, sea level, unquote. That's a whole other issue. So this whole issue of geodesy is about defining reference frames or systems that give us confidence in coordinates and heights across literally the entire planet. And that has now, certainly over the last, almost 40 years, because the first GPS satellite went up 40 years ago this past February. Now we enjoy global coordinate systems, but that was not always the case. If we look at going back to the earliest distinctions about what the Earth looks like, the Cassinis, who, to one extent or another, basically owned the French Observatory, based on their observations near Paris, they postulated that the Earth is a prolated ellipse. That is, that it's elongated at the poles and flattened at the equator. And Sir Isaac Newton says, hockey pucks. Well, probably not hockey pucks, but something to that effect. Newton, who was not a surveyor, who was a physicist and mathematician, Newton says, no, it can't be. It has to be an oblated ellipse. That is, it's flattened at the poles and elongated at the equator because the Earth rotates on its axis. So after much haranguing, and this was a big nation, several nations, of course the French and the British, a lot of this goes on. The French decide to end the conversation. They send 2 field units out. The guys at the top, Pierre Le Condamine and Pierre Bouguer, they go to what was then referred to as Peru, modern Ecuador, and they're going to measure a meridian arc. That is, a piece of meridian. A meridian is a line that goes from the North Pole to the South Pole and passes through you. So they can say, we're going to measure a meridian from Quito to a point south, and we're going to do 2 degrees of measurement. And at the same time, you're going to hit the bottom, Maupertuis is going to go up to what they call Lapland, today it's Finland. And he's going to do the same thing. So he's going to be near the pole. The other guy's going to be down near the equator. Maupertuis goes to Finland. You can see he was up there from 1736 to 37. He was actually up there for 18 months. The other guy's in Peru for 10 years almost, 9 years before they get back to Paris. They bring all the data back. Instrument picture you see over there on the side, quadrant was the type of instrument that they were using. They make their measurements, they come back to Paris, and, well, Newton wins. I love the little comment that says there from Voltaire, Maupertuis went to the ends of the earth to find out that which Newton discovered from his desk. I love that. That settled whether or not, it gave us the general size of the Earth. That it was not elongated at poles, it was elongated along the lines of the equator. Now the hard work comes in. How big is it really? Well, we're left with really distinct problems because measurements, optical measurements, with instruments, well, somewhat like these. These are optical surveying, is very, very precise optical surveying telescopes, theodolites, are limited. Can only go as far as I can see. So I can't see from North America, let's say, to Europe. I can't see from North America to Asia. So what would happen is institutions around the world, countries, scientific institutions, would work together or work separately and define their own values. So we have the general shape of an ellipse, a mathematical ellipse. Now we know the Earth doesn't look like that. The Earth is not a mathematical model. But the concept of the ellipse gives us a mathematical surface from which we can now construct coordinates that will work with one another. If we use the actual shape of the Earth, you can see it doesn't take much to figure out, with all the variations in the surface of the Earth, there's no way that you can construct a common set of coordinates. So you have to come up with something that most closely approximates the size and shape of the Earth. And that's the big issue. Oh, okay, how close is it? All right, so the British go off and they do their work in the UK, and they come up with a model. So it's okay, we've made some measurements in the UK, and we think it looks like this. And the French are doing the same thing. The British are doing the same thing in India. And we're doing the same thing here. And people are doing the same thing around the world. And until about 1979, up until 79, there were over 60 different mathematical models for the size and shape of the Earth, based upon individual sets of measurements that individual countries would have. And sometimes they were political in nature. One of the best examples, I just absolutely love this. A really big problem that, well, all the militaries found, but more precisely thinking the US military, found in World War II were that maps from different countries didn't match one another. There was no common set of mapping almost anywhere they would go. And obviously maps are crucial pieces of information for moving people. People, goods, services, whatever it is. So you want to know where places are, and you want maps to fit together. Oh, I'm at the end of my map, I want a next map over here, and I want to make sure that they all fit together. Well, virtually every country in Europe had their own inconsistent mapping systems. So at the end of World War II, with the development of NATO, all the NATO countries came together and said, okay, we're going to use a common system. That made good sense. And most of that was pushed by what was in the U.S. Army Map Service, which at the time was over here in Bethesda. The Soviets and those behind the Iron Curtain, they did the same thing. They understood the same issues. Those in Western Europe used one particular model for the size and shape of the Earth, which is based on their observations in Europe. The Soviets and the countries that they influenced, Eastern Bloc countries, they used a different mathematical model. So you're telling me if I'm standing in Austria and I step over the boundary into Czechoslovakia, the size and shape of the Earth changes? That's ludicrous. That's ludicrous. Sometimes these things were done politically or for a variety of other reasons. So for decades, uncommon coordinate systems were pretty much the rule around the world. But you know, it didn't really make much difference because, again, we did not have, to a great extent, significant ways in which individuals could navigate themselves. We had a map. If you want to go to Grand Lodge, you got a map. You know? And if the roads were on the map, you follow the roads. And if you know how to read a map, if you were born with a map plan, you could read that and you could get there. But using tools as we now have today, such as the global positioning system, it doesn't work. In 1979, an international meeting in Canberra, Australia, adopted a common model for the size and shape of the Earth that we work with today. So that's just a little bit of history as to what's been occurring. The biggest part of actually determining those coordinates for the multitudes of decades before that was almost exclusively astronomical. The surface that we live on, this brown line or black line, whichever appears to you, that's our topographic surface. This mathematical model of the size and shape of the Earth, well, obviously it's not physical. I can't dig a hole down here and go down 64 meters and find a red line that says, oh, that's the reference ellipse. It's purely mathematical. It's this green line. This is the biggie. This green line, see it here referred to as the geoid. Geoid is an equal potential surface to which gravity is normal and most closely approximates mean sea level on a global basis. Again, it should roll off your tongue. And if that does not, on your way home, get that tattooed on the other arm. Don't do the neck thing because it's harder to read that way. But that's the surface. These are the two. The surface we live on, which is where we're making observations, obviously. But because the surface we live on undulates, changes from place to place, we need a common, smooth, mathematical surface to create our coordinates, latitude and longitude. So that's this little red line. But when we make a measurement with any kind of precision instrument, this happens to be a Wild. Wild is they were a very, very high-end Swiss instrument maker. Wild T3, Kern DKM3, almost exclusively an astronomical instrument. When you make a measurement, if you haven't already, if you come by a little bit later, you'll notice there's a level bubble in here. This one has one as well. In many ways, these level bubbles are not radically different from one you would have in the drawer, maybe in your kitchen. And you hang a picture and you put a level up there to make sure it's level. That's what this does. These are very, very precise. Very, very sensitive levels. Well, when you level it, when you're hanging a picture, you got that little level hanging there, or maybe you're a carpenter and you have a bigger. You never think about it. Level relative to what? That's the big question. Level relative to what? Well, when you're making precision instruments, or making precision observations, astronomic or terrestrial, it doesn't make any difference. You want that instrument to be perfectly level, but what you are level to is this green line. That's the local attraction of gravity. But what you want is to be level to the red line. That's referred to as a deflection of the vertical. So when we look at the history of astronomy and positioning, the work of Harrison, creating chronometers back in the 1730s, what an amazing issue that was, just to be able to determine longitude. Well, latitude was the same way. Determining our coordinates. The only way we didn't, because we didn't have anything external. We didn't have satellites that gave it to us. So we had to start somehow to determine the latitude and longitude. And the only way to do that in the earliest days was with astronomical measurements to the astronomical coordinate system. So we take the astronomical coordinate system and we want to reduce it to a terrestrial coordinate system. Okay, makes sense. And Chris did a great job of showing the complexities of that, but also identifying the importance of knowing how things are linked together so that one observation can be related to another. That's monumentally critical if you're going to have accurate maps and charts, to be able to go places safely, to deliver goods, products, and services. So when these observatories, which oftentimes had really large telescopes performing astronomical measurements, such as the Aries telescope at Greenwich, it's a big telescope, it is making an observation that is relative to the local gravity field. But we want it relative to this mathematical surface. Well, you can't just change the two. You have to make a variety of different measurements to determine what that deflection of the vertical is. So you make measurements of the gravity field. You make measurements, you bring into your measurement system a mathematical coordinate system. And then by making many of these astronomical observations, you ultimately deduce from that what these variations are. The plumb line of the instrument here to the gravity field versus the plumb line, if you will, to this mathematical surface. And those differences they're not huge. I would suspect if you look in a number of these books that might talk about deflections. The common story for land surveyors, we'd often talk about the motion of the plumb bob. Now, if you've ever driven across eastern Colorado, looks like the top of this table, but pretty soon, here come the Rockies. Now, it doesn't take a lot to figure out that you're driving into a lot of mass. There's a whole lot of mass there in the Rockies. And so the common picture that would be drawn for a class, for example, would show that if I make a measurement and I drop a plumb bob, it is slightly pulled towards the Rockies because there's a lot of mass. So the attraction of gravity is pulling my plumb bob, my measurement, towards that larger mass. That's a critical element. Now, it's not like a plumb bob that's hanging out like this, but through a series of measurements, you can determine what those are, what those measurements are. And you can see, like here, I've determined this. I've done it for the U.S. Naval Observatory right downtown. And there's two deflections, one in the east-west component and one in the north-south. You can see, they're small, 3.4 seconds and 3.1 arc seconds. So they're not very big. But if I take those values, those 3 seconds on both, and I convert that to a distance, my geodetic position, that is, if I'm standing at the observatory, at the top of the dome of the observatory, which was the meridian of the United States, if I'm standing there and I take a GPS observation, I'm going to be different from my astronomical observation, well, about 466 feet. That's a lot. That's a huge amount. So this process of astronomic positioning as the foundation was vitally important to helping us understand the real size and shape of the Earth. And developing these mathematical surfaces so that the institution that both Renee and I work for, now today it's called the National Geodetic Survey, it's the oldest science agency in the federal government. President Jefferson creates the Survey of the Coast on February the 10th, 1807, and that's the agency. It's now part of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, but it's the oldest science agency in the U.S. federal government. And the geodesy part of that is the oldest part of the science in that agency. The agency was created almost exclusively to produce nautical charts. When the British left, they did not leave behind all those wonderful Admiralty charts. So we had no charts. We had no accurate charts. Mariners had their own, and they were basically, they looked like, something that, a 4-year-old on acid might draw. They were pretty terrible. And so he created, Jefferson being a surveyor himself, Jefferson understood the importance of accurate mapping and charting for not only the defense of the country, but the commercial development of the country and safety of life. So he creates this institution, and he hires this guy, Ferdinand Hansard, an expatriate Swiss who was teaching mathematics at West Point at the time. Now, I've read pretty much everything that Ferdinand Hansard ever wrote that's in the public domain. All of his letters to Congress and to the Treasury, the agency was under Treasury at the time. And it didn't take me long to figure out that his personality pretty much matched that photo. He's kind of a pain in the hind quarter, if you will. But it was through him that the beginnings of this foundation that we enjoy today, where everybody enjoys accurate mapping and charting, even if you never think about it. You just get in your car, you have a GPS receiver, or you're using your phone, or whatever it is. The foundation of all of that, we owe to him. In addition, and every American owes him a tremendous debt of gratitude, because not only did he create us, which of course is vitally important, he created the Bureau of Standards. Every time somebody puts a gallon of gas in a car, it's because of Hansard. And at the time, there were no standards in this country. There was a foot in Philadelphia that was different from a foot in Maryland, that was different from a vera in Texas, pounds, and everything was different. He creates the Bureau of Standards. So the institution, the institutionalization of precision measurements and standards begins with the development of this organization in 1807, which gives us the framework. You see, this is the picture of the very first of these monumental surveys. Now kind of cover the country, actually cover the world, that he produced in 1816 and 17. Here's a nice little picture of his camp that his daughter drew. The very large theodolite telescope that he had commissioned made in Europe, Troutman Sims, because there was nobody in this country that could make an instrument like that. So he goes to Europe, gets caught in the War of 1812, he buys all this stuff with his own money, comes back, begins the observations, and in fairly short order gets in trouble with Congress because they want something right now. And making maps, it takes time to perform the surveys for which the maps are produced. It also did not help that he had a special carriage built just to hold the theodolite. And he got in trouble with Secretary Gallatin, who was, at the time, was Secretary of the Treasury. And Gallatin pissed and moaned that he didn't have a carriage. Nobody had built him a carriage. Hassler says, there are many secretaries. There's one theodolite. It did not help his case, though, that he also carried his wine collection. in it, which I think he had to tell him was, no, that's observing fluid. We have to move forward in time a little bit because regrettably many of the earliest instruments were lost. The instrument that he had was destroyed in a storm in 1843, which ultimately led to his death. But here you see a few pictures of some of the astronomical instruments that were used, and that's all they were used for. Geodetic astronomy, determining geodetic latitude and longitude. And I want you to just get a sense of the bulk, how big these things are. You just didn't, I mean, these are portable. They're heavy, and just hauling them up from the car today reminded me I'm not 26 anymore. Because we used to just pop this in a backpack and go climb a 9,000 footer and make your observations all night. Well, these, you don't do that. You had to build local observatories. Down here you see one. It's just, these guys would be on site in some cases for months at a time to perform the special. Obviously they had to have clear nights. So depending upon where in the world you're going, you may not often get that. Very earliest ones, very, very large instruments. This is the latter, probably the last instrument that was produced for purely geodetic astronomy. It's the big brother to this one. And if you lift this one, it's about 35 pounds. That instrument weighs, when it's all together, 195 pounds. And it comes in 3 boxes. 3 boxes. The yoke is in one box, and it's the heavy part. The telescope goes in another box. And the one piece I love, the bubble. This bubble, well, there's several bubbles, but this one, it's called a hanging bubble. This bubble is so precise, you cannot level it in the daytime. Simple expansion of the instrument itself by the sun, throw it out of level. I had occasion to be at an event in North Carolina where we were doing some outreach, and there's an organization in North Carolina Geodetic Survey, great state work. And they had brought out some GPS receivers to show the public as part of this. And I had hauled one of these things along just to show the difference between what we used to do and what we do. And I had set the thing up, and I was then going over to set up chairs or whatever it was. And one of the young men from the Carolina survey kind of called me back, and he goes, "Hey, dude," says, "the surveyor would always level his instrument." Give me a minute. And I walked over to the truck. The bubble comes in its own box, very specialized box. And I got the box out, and it's a holy thing. You spin a prayer wheel, you light incense, you kill a goat, all those things. It's a sacred thing. And you hang the bubble on, and I level it up, and we wait about 32 seconds, and boom! And they're like, whoa! Bubble off, put it back in the box, put it in the truck, leave it alone. Just to give you a sense that this was not a go out one evening, observe a few stars, and we're done. In many cases, you were out for minimum 3-4 nights, 5-6 hours at a time performing your observations. And these were considered portable. These were all considered portable. And they were at the heart, the foundation. Now, the astronomic side of the geodesy pretty much ends in about 1983-84 as GPS now becomes an easier tool to use. Just a picture I throw in to give you a sense of some of the geodetic tools that were used. There's some here I particularly like. This one. Now, it's not an astronomic tool, but I like it because it's about the science. I'm going to talk about the astronomic observatory that the agency had in short order. But this one, this little box, is a tool. It's referred to as a level. Its only function is to determine the difference in heights between 2 points. And arguably, it's the finest one ever made. It's a Zeiss instrument, Zeiss Jena. They were all made in East Germany. So we had to buy instruments from East Germany for good science. I thought that was good. I had to go pick up a load once at the Port of Baltimore. And the customs guys are like, What? No, it's okay, it's legit. But the multitude of different types of instruments that evolved over time, really over about a 200-year period. Some made in-house at the agency. These were very rare. They were not the sort of things that were mass-produced. It wasn't until the 50s that we start to see tools like these actually being mass-produced on any significant level. Just put that in there for just a little bit of background. The teams that we had that did this were what I refer to as nomads, or gypsies. The agency had, these were all federal employees, and these guys living in tents, in trailers. That's how the field teams worked. Typically 30, 35 guys, families, wives, kids, everybody pick up, move around, go from project to project, be on site 2-3 months at a time. And whole careers were done that way. 35, 40, sometimes 50 plus years. Just moving from place to place to place to perform these astronomic and terrestrial observations that form this foundation for what we did. These were federal employees who did this work. Now, the earliest days, and I like these because it gives us a sense of change in time and how small changes in technology can give us superior efficiencies to make the observations from the multitude of these instruments, like many of these, like this one. You have to be able to get above all the things you see here. If we go outside, how far can you see? A few hundred feet? 1,000 feet, maybe? If you go way out west and you're on a mountaintop, well, you can see pretty far. But in most places in the country, you've got trees, you've got houses, you've got hills. You want to get your observations up and over those. So we would actually build towers. These are towers built out of wood. These go back before about 1920. So these are towers built out of wood, well over 100 feet tall. Typically 2 towers, an inner tower and an outer tower. Inner tower, which would hold the instrument and sometimes a signal or a reflector. And then an outer tower, you see a little platform, that's where the observer and the recorder would stand. And they're going to be making up measurements to other towers, sometimes easily 50, 60, 70 miles away. Usually almost always exclusively at night. I almost never observed during the daytime. I had occasion to go to a Maryland Society of Surveyors meeting a few years ago up in Holiday Grace. And a young man there gave a presentation, not unlike one like this. He had become interested in astronomy, just like everybody here. And he gave a nice old after-dinner presentation about what he had learned about. He bought a telescope and he had learned about astronomy. And he ended his presentation with something like, it had been important for him to find out the role that astronomy had played in surveying. He had never been aware of that. And I chatted with him afterwards. And I said, I'd been a surveyor for 3 years before I knew they worked in the daytime. Everything we did was at night. So, the difference in procedure. The process to build these towers, right? You can kind of get a sense. These take a lot of time. And they cost a lot of money. Well, people make major changes. This guy, Jasper Gilby. Jasper Gilby, the Coast and Geodetic Survey, National Geodetic Survey, the agency and the country has been mightily fortunate that this agency has had a litany of major scientists. Most, regrettably, people have never heard of. Alexander Dallas Bache, the great-grandson of Benjamin Franklin, tremendous scientist in his own right. Fillmore, James Fillmore, a scientist who developed instruments and in part designed the size and shape of the Earth that we use in the United States. And to me, this guy, Jasper Gilby. Jasper Gilby comes out of Indiana. He's hired on at 19 years old. He didn't know anything. They hired him as a signaller. And as he had to go to the field and using a variety of techniques determine how tall a tower had to be at one point to see towers that would be built at other points. So he had a big job, a lot of responsibility. And here you see a picture of Jasper up on a pole making one of those observations. I love this guy. This guy was crazy. And he only worked for the agency for 52 years. He was a short-timer. But in 1927, he invents what I refer to as the big boys erector set. He said, if we can do this out of wood, we can make it out of steel. And so he develops this process of building a tower out of steel that a field crew could put together in about 6 hours. 6 or 7 hours, a well-trained crew. For that, he receives the Department of Commerce by then. He receives the Commerce, he gets the Commerce gold medal, and directly from President Hoover at the time. So here you see a picture of the observer with an instrument. One looks just like this. Now, mind you, he's making these observations. He might be over 100 feet in the air, but the position is going to be determined from a point down on the ground. So you have to know exactly how he's coming. A whole nother scientific process. He's well over 100 feet up. I'm going to make sure, and it's not with a big plumb bob with a long string. That doesn't happen. So there are optical instruments that are used to keep the instrument 100 feet in the air or 100 plus collimated over a point in the ground. That's all background in terms of, to me, the fun part of an evening like this. It leads up to the creation of the institution that forms the science for positioning. Because without that institution, nothing's really going to happen. We now have what we refer to as the Chandler wobble. The Earth wobbles on its axis. I think most of us kind of know that. And if you have any object that is not spherical and you spin it, it will wobble. The Earth wobbles for a variety of different reasons. But we now can measure it. And today it's rather easy to measure, but back then, not so much. So what you see here, between 1884 and 85, this guy in Berlin, Küstner, who has an observatory with a big telescope, and he's observing latitude. And many observatories around the world would do similar kinds of things. It was a very common measurement system, or practice back in those days. And what Küstner notes is that his latitude varies over time. And he has no way of deciphering what this is. He writes a brief paper about it. It's picked up by Seth Carlo Chandler, an American astronomer. And Chandler, working with the Coast and Geodetic Survey, Chandler's out of Harvard, working with the Coast and Geodetic Survey and their connections around the world, he obtains instruments. He goes to places like Hawaii and Alaska and to many parts of the United States, and he performs his own observations over a period of years. And then he writes the seminal work that defines the fact that, yes, the Earth wobbles on its axis. It's now referred to as the Chandler wobble. It's actually much more complex than that. We've learned a lot more about it since those earliest days. But this wobble changes the latitude. And as you can see, as it says here, it doesn't change by what sounds like very much, just a couple of arc seconds. But over the whole period, well over 9 meters. Well, now you'd think, well, if I'm at the pole, what is 9 meters? Who cares about that? Well, if I'm making very, very precise astronomical observations and trying to fit things together over continental scales, I need to know what that is. If I make a measurement to the pole today, I think I'm measuring to the pole, but in reality, the pole, the physical pole, not necessarily the location of Polaris, but the physical pole has now moved. I need to know what that difference is so I can apply it to my measurements, so that they will be consistent with other measurements that will be made later in time, or that were made earlier in time. How do we know what this is? We have no structure, absolutely no structure for determining this. So he writes the paper. The paper gets the attention of the International Geodesy Association, which in 1897 helps to support the creation of a series of observatories. You see them listed here. All around the world at 39 degrees and 8 minutes. Kind of a weird number. 39 degrees, 8 minutes. I mean, if you think of a globe, and you go, well, if I wanted to know latitude changing, why wouldn't I do it at 45 degrees? Well, if you think about it, this is 1890s. What's at 45 degrees in the United States in the 1890s? Yeah, not a whole heck of a lot. Right? Not a whole heck of a lot. But, as it turns out, 39 degrees and 8 minutes passes through Gaithersburg, Maryland, which is not very far from Washington, D.C., which is the headquarters of the Coast and Geodetic Survey. And the guy, there's always a guy, the guy who was in charge of all astronomic observations for the agency lived in Rockville, just a couple of miles away. It also passes through the observatory in Misazawa, Japan. The Japanese like that idea. And as it just so happens, it also passes through Cincinnati. There's an observatory in Cincinnati, Ohio. And it just happens to pass right through there as well. So all of those things coming together, the institutions around the world, one in Italy, another one in Russia, and a couple of these changed. Cincinnati was shut down in 1915, the one in Russia moved around a little bit. And when we think of observatories, you think of you have a picture of an observatory in your head, we all might think of a place like, Lick or Palomar or something like that. There's nothing like that. Most of the observatories, you're going to see a picture in a minute, they look like somebody's garden shed. But they were built exclusively to determine latitude. And it just so happens we do have the one right here in Gaithersburg. So they were all designed as part of what's referred to as the International Latitude Observatories. Here you see a picture of the observer with the telescope that was at, there it is. It's at Gaithersburg. All of the instruments, you'll see it in a minute, all of these instruments were constructed by the same person, Julius von Schaff in Berlin. All the observatories had the same instrument. They're exceedingly heavy. They're beautiful pieces, absolutely beautiful pieces. The observers, we built a house, so the observer lived right on site. Didn't have to go there. Just lived, at the observatory himself. They were spaced around the country. And then the Coast and Geodetic Survey managed two of them. The one in Gaithersburg, Maryland, just literally up the street, and the one in Ukiah, California. The one in Cincinnati was managed by the local observatory and funded by the Coast and Geodetic Survey. So each night, the observer would go out using zenith telescopes like this. Telescopes were, as I said, they were all the same. 108 millimeter objective, 130 centimeter focal length. They weigh about 250 pounds a piece, a little bit more than that. A typical set of observations would last 6 hours. And the last observer, well, both of the observers in Ukiah and in Gaithersburg were friends of mine. I had wanted that job. I wanted to be that guy. When I was quite young in the agency in 1972, I had to go up to Gaithersburg to deliver some materials. When I saw this place and I saw what this guy did, I was like, I'm having that job. And I had focused my career to be that guy. And technology changes. Sometimes that just sucks. So, but a typical evening, observations, as long as the evening was clear, would last about 6 hours. The observatory would be open about an hour ahead of time, right? So that the instruments could acclimate. Then the observer would go out, and there is a marker on the site. It's referred to as an azimuth marker, so it's a directional marker, so the instrument had to be aligned in the meridian every night. And then he would perform a series of observations on pairs of stars, both to the north and the south along his meridian. And everybody was observing the same stars. So if you were observing one set of stars in Gaithersburg at one point in time, roughly about 12 hours later, the guys in Japan is observing the same set of stars. And this just went on night after night after night after night for over 100 years, almost 100 years. There were a couple of minor breaks in the observing period. But one of the things we were talking about at dinner, to me, one of the most wonderful part of this piece of science was that even during World War I and World War II, when countries were blowing each other up, the observations continued, and the workflow just kept on going. Particularly during World War II, when things were particularly nasty, of course, all the observations from Gaithersburg and Ukiah were wrapped up and they were sent to Switzerland. And the Swiss gave them to the Germans in Potsdam. And the Germans would perform the computations and they would give them back to the Swiss, and the Swiss would share them back with us. So while the world is trying to destroy itself, the science goes on. It's quite heartening, particularly in light of some things that pass. So it's just a tremendous little piece of history, astronomic and scientific history that's sitting in our own backyard. So it's still there, and obviously you can go up there anytime. Like I said, the instrument is not at the observatory right now. It's at the headquarters of the park system in Gaithersburg. What was left behind in many of these cases were survey markers. In fact, many of you probably walked over them hundreds of times and never even noticed them. If you go to all that effort to perform these measurements, you need to leave something reasonably permanent behind so that the next user, surveyor or engineer or whoever needs these services, come along and find them. I love it, particularly like this one. We used to call this guy Marvin Marker, and we'd send them out to the public whenever we had something, but there's millions of them. It's all freely available through the National Geodetic Survey's online database. Here just see just a couple of favorites of mine. Standard kind of poured-in-place concrete post with a brass, bronze, or aluminum cap in the top. A benchmark, a point of precisely known elevation, 1877. It's the point of known elevation that we began surveying all the way across the country from. It's in Hagerstown, so it's just literally up the street. Anybody here go down to the Outer Banks in the summertime? A couple of you? Body Island North Base, 1848. Baseline monuments established by Alexander Dallas Page. Take a walk out through the muck and mire and the chiggers and mosquitoes, and it's a great find. Don't take somebody who doesn't like that stuff with you. Today, it's all gone. Geodetic Astronomy, when I joined the agency in '72, there was a Geodetic Astronomy division. That morphed into satellite geodesy. By 1984, we had completely quit doing anything that was optical, or almost anything that was optical. A few things from time to time. But today, the global positioning system has taken over all of that. And what you see here are just some pictures of continuously tracking stations. That is, they're taking measurements typically every 1 to 5 seconds. So we know exactly where their positions are on the surface of the Earth. And that information can be made available to anybody else who is doing high accuracy positioning with GPS. And just some highlights to kind of close everything out here. The first satellite goes up, GPS satellite goes up in '78. But some big things happen, or going to happen. And I'm not going to go through all of these. But October this year, the United States should, you see my question mark, should, it's been delayed a couple of times, will launch the first Block 3 satellite. That's a whole new constellation, a whole new architecture of GPS. It will dramatically change positioning for literally everybody on the planet. And you see my bottom line here? 2020, but notice my question mark. I don't know if it's 2020, it might be 2030. We're looking at 10 centimeter positioning in a cell phone. So this is much bigger than 10 centimeters. So the accuracy of your location in 2025 or 2027, whatever it's going to be, will be inside the cell phone. So imagine the potential for accurate positioning with, if we just the United States, 300 million plus people, and their capacity to share that information. the mind boggles. And then we have to stop. Every time I say GPS, I then have to say, stop ever saying GPS again. We need to say GNSS, Global Navigation Satellite Systems, because the Russians have theirs, GLONASS, the European Union, Galileo, and the Chinese, their system, Beidou. And by the end of 2020, those 4 constellations will have well over 120 satellites giving us position, timing, and navigation. So the future of all of this is beyond my meager powers of comprehension. How I like to put this in, it's the first commercially available GPS receiver, called a Micrometer V1000. It cost our agency $250,000 each. And we had 7 of them. We had 7 of them. We had the largest collection of anybody anywhere on the planet. 7, $250,000 a piece. Today, land surveyors and geodesists, people who need precise position. Oh, and but here's the antenna, little antenna. This is called a ground plane. Make sure that signals that are reflected from other sources, not directly from the satellites, are mitigated. This is the receiver. It weighs about 190 pounds when we put it in the back of a Suburban to be able to do that. And you literally almost needed a PhD just to determine one vector from one of those things. And today, if you have the IQ of a squirrel, you can do this. And this is the kind of equipment that surveyors and geodesists and engineers use, and it's nowhere near $250,000 a pop. Just very quickly, a little bit of history about it. And I love this part because it goes back to my earliest time in astronomy. Beginning in the early 60s, the agency that we worked for realized that if we have satellites in space, we can position ourselves on the ground. And what they did is they devised a system using a satellite that was known as ECHO and PAGEOS. There's a number of you in here I know old enough to remember the ECHO satellites, right? And if you lived in this area, again, I lived in Tyson's Corner, we used to be able to call the Washington Post, and it would tell you, this is how big a deal stuff in science was. It would tell you what time the ECHO satellite was going to pass over. ECHO was put up as a telecommunication satellite. It was a big balloon, had a lot of reflective surface, so the idea is reflect microwaves off of it. When it passed over, other than the moon and the sun, it was the brightest object in the sky. And I can remember standing out in my front yard over there in Tyson's Corner at 1 o'clock in the morning with a couple of my buddies, and you're just watching this thing pass over, and it's like, this is Buck Rogers, the space age, whatever it is. You know, today, we don't enjoy that. We don't see that. And sometimes you can see the International Space Station, you know, it's tiny and it's dim, you know, but how far we've come. The agency used that as a tool because they would take pictures of it against the star background. They take cool star pictures. You know, here's the satellite against the star background. And then by knowing its location in space, you can determine our position on the surface of the Earth. So it predates GPS. And then along with work that was being conducted by the Navy developing what was then called the Doppler system to position nuclear submarines. The whole idea is if they could position a nuclear submarine within roughly about 200 meters from one pass of a satellite, they were good to go. And this is really the daddy of the global positioning system that we enjoy today. There's a picture of Doppler with VLBI, very long baseline interferometry. So again, we're talking about astronomy, but now it's not optical astronomy. It's radio astronomy. And VLBI, very long baseline interferometry, using radio telescopes, is to this day one of the most major portions of our global science network for positioning. VLBI measures distances between intercontinental distances to accuracies of a few millimeters using observations from quasars. So you have a quasar that's a regular emitter of a radio source, and that radio source goes through the universe, it hits the surface, it hits the Earth, and by the time it gets to the Earth, it's basically a plane. So it passes through the phase center of some antenna, like this one, and that might be, a typical one here in the United States would be up at Green Bank in West Virginia, and they would measure to Uppsala, Sweden, to an accuracy of about 2 millimeters. And then you keep doing that, doing that, and doing that, and what you find is North America and Europe are moving apart. So it was this technology, this space-based astronomic technology that gave us our first indication of plate tectonic motions. All the plates are moving around the world, and how things change with time. And just as an example is what we see in the United States. And if you don't like living here, it's too cold maybe in the wintertime. If you wait about 212 million years, we're going to be about where Scottsdale, Arizona is. I leave you with a couple of good books. These are really good books. If you have any interest in this part of the science, I would highly recommend it. And they're both easy reads. They're good reads. The Measure of the Earth. Measure of the Earth talks about this French team that went down to South America to measure the arc of the Meridian. And the other one, The Measure of All Things, again, a French team that ultimately gave us the metric system. So they're both excellent reads. Not written by scientists, both by historians, but they are very, very well done. The science is not deep, but it's pretty good. They did a good job. I leave you with a couple of little things. If you have any interest in any of these topics, you've got my email address from this point. I'm happy to talk to you about anything. But there's also some nice YouTube videos that the Florida Geospatial Users Group has put up. So if you have any interest, they're like 1 hour long to talk about these different elements in functions of geodesy, surfaces, horizontal datums, vertical datums. We are actually getting a whole new coordinate system and height system for the United States in 2022. So if you have anything that you're doing in business that has any interest in that, you should find out about it. Last but not least, I always end with good coordination begins with good coordinates, like in the astronomy. And geography, that geodesy is a felony. Exceedingly a pleasure to be here tonight. I could never have imagined standing here when I was 13 years old, standing in my backyard with my cheap little telescope that Mom and Dad bought me all those years ago. So I'm deeply honored to be a part of your evening here. And I highly recommend, if you get a chance, drive up to Gaithersburg sometime and just take a little tour of the observatory.